In 1934, a man named Elias Vance made his final run on the Orphan trains. He had driven those routes for over 2 decades, watching children loaded onto platforms from cities that no longer matched their official histories. He kept a journal, not the kind they let conductors keep, a private one written in shorthand that took his granddaughter 40 years to decode. In it, he wrote about where the children actually came from, not orphanages, not the crowded tenements of New York. He wrote about buildings that had no business existing in 1880. He wrote about children who remembered languages nobody could identify. He wrote about what they told him in the dark, as the train moved west through land that the maps had already begun to erase. What Elias Vance saw on those platforms did not match the story the newspapers printed, and when his granddaughter finally translated his journal in 1974, she understood immediately why he had never spoken a word of it aloud. If you want the unfiltered version of this story, the names, the decoded journal entries, the locations Elias marked on his private maps, all of that is on the Patreon. The link is in the description. Everything here stays as close to the documented record as we can manage. What you are about to hear is what the official history left on the platform. The orphan train movement is one of the most extensively documented social programs in American history, and yet the closer you look at the documentation, the more it begins to unravel. The official version goes like this. Between 1,854 and 1,929, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000, children were relocated from the crowded eastern seaboard to rural homes across the Midwest and the West. The program was organized by Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society. The children were taken from streets, from overcrowded orphanages, from families too broken to keep them, placed on trains, and distributed to farming families who needed labor and were told they were offering homes. The trains stopped at small towns. The children were lined up on platforms. Families walked up and looked them over. Some were chosen. The program ended in 1929 when state child welfare laws made it impossible to continue. Clean story. Sad, but clean. The kind of story that gets its own museum exhibit and a commemorative stamp. Elias Vance drove those trains from 1911 to 1934, 5 years past the official end of the program. That detail alone should give you pause, because 1,929 is presented as a hard stop in every academic source. Yet, Vance's employment records, which his granddaughter located in a regional railroad archive in Iowa, show continuous service on what the company internally called the welfare transit routes through 1,934. He was not retired. He was not reassigned. He drove the same routes, he loaded the same cargo, 5 years after the program officially ended. His granddaughter, a woman named Ruth Alderman, was not a researcher. She was a retired schoolteacher in Dubuque who inherited a locked metal box when her grandmother died in 1968, passed down with one instruction: do not open it until after I am gone. Ruth waited 6 years, then opened it in 1974. Inside were 41 handwritten notebooks, a hand-drawn map of the American interior with notations in an unrecognized shorthand, 3 identification cards for children whose names appeared in no orphanage registry she later checked, and a folded letter in German she never translated. She spent the next decade working through the shorthand with a retired cryptographer she met through a church group in Cedar Rapids. They finished in 1983. Ruth died in 1991 without publishing any of it. Her daughter Carol gave a single interview to a regional alternative newspaper in 1994 and then went silent. That interview is where most of what follows originates. What Elias Vance wrote in those notebooks was not a confession. It was a field observation log, the way a scientist might document an experiment he was not fully authorized to understand. He wrote in shorthand because he understood that what he was seeing was not supposed to be seen, and he chose words that gave him distance from the implications of what he was recording. But the content, once decoded, was not about routes or schedules. It was about the children, where they came from, what they said, what the buildings looked like in the places where they were collected. The first thing Vance noted, repeatedly across multiple years of journals, was that the children did not match the origin stories printed on their intake cards. Every child had a card listing a name, an approximate age, a city of origin, and a reason for placement. Vance began reading those cards carefully around 1,915 and noticed discrepancies immediately. Children listed as coming from New York tenements who did not speak English as a primary language. Children listed as 8 or 9 years old with the bone structure of much older children. Children listed as orphaned by disease or poverty who, when asked quietly in the dark of the car, described parents who were alive and buildings that were still standing. He initially assumed bureaucratic carelessness. He had no framework yet for what he was actually looking at. The framework came slowly. It came from the children themselves, from the fragments they shared in those long night hours when the train was moving, and the social workers slept at the front and the conductor sat in the back and listened. Vance was not threatening. He was large and quiet and brought extra bread, and did not ask the children to perform gratitude. They talked to him, not all of them. But enough of them, over 23 years, that a pattern emerged which he documented with the precision of someone who understood he was recording something that did not fit inside the official story of the world. The children described buildings. This is the detail that appears most consistently across the journals. Not the cramped tenements of the Lower East Side, not the brick factory neighborhoods of Chicago. They described buildings with ceilings so high that the upper floors were lost in shadow, buildings with corridors that curved in ways that made no architectural sense, buildings with heating that operated without visible fuel, buildings with water that came from somewhere inside the walls and was always clean, buildings with windows not made from glass as anyone in 1915 would have understood glass. They described floors smooth, in a way no wooden or stone floor was smooth, a continuous, unbroken surface like the inside of a bowl. They described light that came from the walls themselves, not from fixtures or gas jets or electrical bulbs, a general luminescence that made the rooms bright without casting shadows. Vance wrote that he thought at first they were confabulating, inventing fantastical memories as a response to trauma. He had read enough popular psychology by the 1920s to know that children under stress invented things, but the descriptions were too consistent. Children who boarded the train in different cities, in different years, who had no contact with one another, described the same buildings in the same terms. The curved corridors, the shadowless light, the water from inside the walls, the floors like the inside of a bowl. He began writing the descriptions down verbatim, and when he compared entries from 1,916 to entries from 1,924, the language was almost identical. These children were remembering the same place. The question of where that place was is where the journals become most difficult to interpret, because Vance himself did not know. His earliest theory was that the children were coming from some kind of institutional facility, a hospital or a sanitarium operating outside normal municipal oversight. His later theory, the one that appears in the journals from the late 1920s onward, was more unsettling. He began to suspect the buildings the children described were part of a larger infrastructure, something built at a scale that no private institution and no single government agency could have funded or constructed within the timeline the official history of the country allowed. This is where Tartaria enters the picture. Not as a fringe concept, as a description of something the architectural and historical record in North America has never adequately explained. Because if you look at the buildings demolished or repurposed between roughly 1,870 and 1,930, the massive domed civic structures, the train terminals with their cathedral ceilings, the courthouses and exhibition halls that appeared in American cities almost simultaneously, appearing not after decades of accumulated wealth but seemingly all at once, in small towns that had no business having them, built in a style the academic record calls Beaux-Arts, but that does not match the construction timeline those labels require. What you are looking at is the remnant infrastructure of something that preceded the story we have been given about the development of this continent. The Orphan trains ran through the heart of that infrastructure. Vance's routes took him through towns in Ohio and Indiana and Iowa and Kansas, where the stations were built at a scale that dwarfed any commercial need. He described pulling into a station in a western Kansas town of 400 people and looking up at a ceiling 60 feet overhead, at iron columns that had not rusted despite decades of exposure, at tile work showing no wear despite heavy foot traffic. He began photographing these stations on his own time with a personal camera he purchased in 1921. He never mentioned what happened to those photographs. They were not in the box Ruth opened in 1974. The children who described luminescent rooms and curved corridors were describing something consistent with what researchers in this field call the Tartarian infrastructure. The logic being this, that the civilization which built the large civic structures visible in American cities in the late 19th century was not the civilization that claimed to have built them. Those structures were inherited, repurposed, or discovered intact. The story of their construction, the foundation-laying ceremonies, the cornerstone dedications, the architect biographies, was a narrative layer applied after the fact to explain the presence of buildings that had not been constructed by the civilization now occupying them. And the spaces beneath and behind those buildings, the spaces the children described, were the original interior geography of a world that had been reset. The reset is not an apocalypse in the Hollywood sense, not a single catastrophic event that levels everything and leaves survivors picking through rubble. What the evidence suggests, and the evidence includes mud flood deposits, the first-floor burial of buildings across multiple continents, anomalous sediment layers visible in the basements of 19th-century structures, photographs of buildings being excavated rather than constructed, is a more gradual process. A process by which a previous civilization's infrastructure was covered, repurposed, and narratively reassigned. The people who came through it as the dominant force inherited buildings they had not built and constructed a history that began with themselves, casting the previous world as non-existent, absorbing the surviving population into a new social order. The children on the orphan trains fit this framework precisely. Because if the reset happened, if there was a previous civilization in North America operating at a significantly higher level of technological sophistication than the narrative allows, then what happened to the people who lived inside that civilization becomes pressing. The official history is not short on explanations for displaced orphaned children. Industrialization, poverty, immigration, disease, all of these were real. But Vance was not noting children who matched those explanations. He was noting children who described interiors no 19th century building contained. He was noting children whose intake cards listed origins that did not check out. He was noting children who arrived at collection points from directions that corresponded to no nearby settlement. He documented this specifically in a 1927 notebook entry. He arrived at a listed station in Nebraska to pick up 11 children. The children were there, but they had not come from the direction of town. They had come from the east, from open land, walking a road that appeared on no map Vance could access. They were accompanied by 2 adults who handed over the intake cards without speaking, who turned and walked back along the same road and were gone before the train pulled out. The intake cards for those 11 children listed their city of origin as Cincinnati. Vance had come from Cincinnati 2 days earlier. He had not picked up those children in Cincinnati. This pattern, children arriving from unverifiable origins with cards listing cities they could not have come from, appears across multiple years and multiple collection points. Vance began noting the compass direction from which children arrived at outdoor collection points, places where loading happened not from a station platform but from an open field or a road junction. The directions did not correspond to nearby towns. In several cases, children arrived from directions that placed their origin on a standard map in the middle of open plains, with no settlement within 50 miles. He began marking these directions on his private map. The map Ruth found in the box in 1974. The map Carol described in her 1994 interview as showing a network of lines radiating from interior points that did not correspond to any city or road on a conventional American atlas. What Vance was mapping was the access network of whatever remained of the previous world, not the surface buildings, the ones repurposed and given new histories, the subsurface infrastructure, the parts not filled in or built over, the parts still being used, quietly, by people who understood what they were. The orphan trains were not merely a charitable program, they were a transfer mechanism, a way of moving children out of the remaining pockets of the previous civilization and into the new social order that needed a growing labor base and had the legal framework and logistical infrastructure to absorb displaced populations, without asking too many questions about where they had come from. The receiving end was equally strange. Vance describes the public placement events in terms that match the official record. Families came, children stood, selection happened. But he also describes, in multiple entries, a secondary process that happened after the official count was logged. Children not selected at public placement were sometimes removed from the train between stops, at night, by individuals who boarded at unscheduled locations and left with specific children without paperwork. He was told these were private placements, families who had arranged adoption through a different channel. He found this explanation insufficient. The people collecting those children did not behave like prospective parents, they behaved like people collecting inventory. He wrote about this with the restraint of a man who understood that his job and his liberty depended on not asking certain questions aloud. But the restraint in the prose is itself informative. Some of the children were being delivered to destinations that had nothing to do with the official program. Some of those destinations were determined before the train left the eastern collection points. Some of the children were selected before they ever reached a public platform. The public placement events, the families and the lineups, and the choosing, those were for a subset of the cargo. The rest moved through a different channel. The buildings the children described on those trains were not, in Vance's later assessment, the buildings they had been taken from. They were the buildings where they had been held in the interval between their original lives and their appearance at collection points. This connects to the mud flood hypothesis in ways that deserve attention. If the previous civilization's infrastructure was covered by sediment during the reset, the portions most deeply embedded in the earth would have survived the covering in better condition than the above-ground portions. The above-ground portions became the civic architecture of the 19th century, claimed by the new civilization and given new histories. The below-grade portions remained in the possession of whoever had access to them. And in the American interior during the orphan train years, something had access to them. Something that used them to house populations and arranged for those populations' children to be transferred into the mainstream social order when the mechanisms existed to absorb them. The language question is one that researchers keep returning to. Because the intake cards listing children as coming from New York or Philadelphia also listed their primary language, and a significant number listed English when the children did not speak English at all. Vance described children who, when addressed directly, did not respond, not because they were frightened, but because they appeared not to recognize the language itself. They were not ignoring him. They were listening to sounds that did not map onto any communication system they possessed. He also describes attempts by some children to communicate in languages he could not identify. He had basic German, some French, recognized Spanish and Italian and Slavic languages from other roots. None of what these children spoke matched any of those. He wrote that it sounded like something that had developed separately, like a plant that grows in a room with no windows and produces a flower that matches nothing in the outside taxonomy. This detail connects to a gap the academic consensus on language in North America does not account for. Every indigenous language group has been catalogued and studied. What no catalogue includes is the possibility that a non-indigenous civilization, neither pre-Columbian indigenous nor European colonial, had been present on the continent long enough to develop its own distinct linguistic tradition. If the Tartarian civilization operated in the interior for a period measured in centuries rather than decades, and if the reset event did not destroy its entire population, the survivors and their descendants would have continued developing a language in isolation, in the subsurface infrastructure, for however many generations passed between the reset and the orphan train era. The children Vance encountered who spoke nothing he recognized were speaking a language that had never been mapped because the civilization that produced it had never been officially acknowledged. Vance's 1934 run, his last, is documented in more detail than any previous run. He knew it was his last. He had been told, through channels he does not describe, that the routes were being permanently discontinued. He wrote that he was not surprised. He wrote that the change was not primarily about state child welfare laws, which was the official explanation. The change was about the surface world catching up to what had been operating beneath it. The expansion of federal land survey programs, the increase in aerial photography for agricultural planning, the growth of road infrastructure into previously uncharted areas of the interior had made concealment of the below-grade structures increasingly difficult. The secondary operation that had used the orphan trains as its transfer mechanism needed a different mechanism, one less dependent on a program with public documentation and public accountability. His services were no longer required. He drove his last route, delivered his last group of children, wrote his final notebook entry at a station in Iowa on a November evening in 1934, locked the notebooks in the metal box, and handed it to his wife without explanation. The metal box sat in closets and attics for 40 years. It survived a house fire in 1951 that destroyed most of the family's other possessions. It survived 3 relocations. It sat in Ruth's closet for 6 years before she opened it. The cryptographer who helped decode the journals grew increasingly reluctant as the project continued, which is a detail worth noting. A retired professional who had spent a career processing sensitive encoded information, growing reluctant to continue reading the notebooks of a railroad conductor. Carroll said he had told Ruth near the end of the project that he wanted it noted, in whatever Ruth eventually did with the material, that he had decoded the text as a technical exercise and did not want to be characterized as endorsing the conclusions. He finished the work. He gave Ruth the transcripts. He did not stay in touch after that. The map Carroll described in her interview is the element that has generated the most sustained interest. She said it was drawn on paper that felt different from ordinary paper, thicker and more flexible, surviving decades in the box without the yellowing or brittling that paper from that era normally shows. The map depicted the United States accurately at the coastlines and major river systems, but contained features that corresponded to nothing on a modern geographic survey. There were structures marked in the interior, not cities or towns, something more like geological notations, except that the marks were architectural in character. They indicated buildings, complexes, in locations where, on any standard map, there was nothing but open land. Carol said she had tried once to overlay her father's road atlas onto the map, aligning the coastlines and rivers, then marking on the atlas where Vance's architectural notations fell. None of them fell on any listed city or town. Several fell in the middle of national grasslands or federal rangeland. One fell in a location in western Nebraska she had driven through in the late 1960s, a stretch she remembered because it had struck her as strange. There had been a paved road in good repair running south from the highway toward a low rise in the land, and at the end of the road, partially below the level of the surrounding plain, the top of a structure with proportions that were not agricultural and not commercial, and not anything her vocabulary reached for easily. She had not stopped. She had driven on. She had not thought about it again until she overlaid the road atlas onto her grandfather's map and found that the notation for that region of Nebraska fell precisely in the location where she had seen the road leading to the partially buried structure. The story of Elias Vance is not provable in the way academic history requires proof. The journals have not been published. The map has not been made available for independent examination. The employment records, Ruth, located in Iowa, have not been independently verified. None of this means the story is false. It means the story is the kind the systems designed to verify stories were also designed to make unverifiable. The Orphan Train program was real and enormous, and it moved an enormous number of children through an enormous territory over an enormous span of time. The record of that movement is held in archives that are not fully digitized, not fully catalogued, not fully accessible. The names of the children on those trains are in many cases still not matched to the adults those children became, because the program was designed to dissolve identities as efficiently as it relocated bodies. A program designed to dissolve identities is a program that can carry within it, without visible trace, a secondary operation built on the same dissolution. The children who describe the luminescent rooms are old now, in the accounting that takes their descriptions as real. Old or dead. The ones who survived their placements, found homes, built lives in the new social order, are indistinguishable from the people around them. The dissolution worked. Whatever they remembered of the curved corridors and the water from inside the walls, whatever language they spoke before the intake cards gave them new names and new origins, that is buried now under decades of surface life. But the buildings they came from are still there. The sediment that covered the reset civilization was not infinitely deep. The survey drones and agricultural mapping and infrared imaging conducted on federal land in the American interior over the last 30 years have produced anomalies that agencies have characterized as geological features, karst formations, ancient river channels. The shapes are architectural. The geometries are regular. They are below ground. And in the locations where the data is accessible enough to check, they correspond to locations on a railroad conductor's private map that has been sitting in a box in Iowa since 1934. What Elias Vance understood, by the end, was not the full picture. He was a conductor. He moved things from one place to another, and he paid attention to what he moved, and he wrote down what he saw with the careful precision of a man who knew he was the only person recording it. He knew the intake cards did not match the children. He knew the children's buildings did not match the architecture of the world he lived in. He knew that some of the children left the trains at night at unscheduled stops, and did not appear in any public placement record. He knew the program continued 5 years after it officially ended. He wrote all of it down in a shorthand dense enough to take a decade to decode, locked it in a box, gave it to his wife, and did not speak of it again. That is the record. That is what the last conductor left behind. Not a confession, not an accusation. A field log. The observations of a careful man who drove a train through the middle of a world being quietly disassembled and reassembled around him, who understood that the children loaded onto his cars at platforms, not on any official map, were not orphans in any sense the word was meant to carry. They were transfers. The living remainder of something the surface world had decided to absorb rather than acknowledge. And the conductor wrote it down, locked it away, and the box survived, and the shorthand was decoded, and one woman gave one interview, and then went quiet. The maps are still in the box, the buildings are still in the ground. And the routes Elias Vance drove, the ones that continued past the official end date, connecting collection points to destinations that appear in no charitable program registry, those routes did not end because the infrastructure ended. They ended because the infrastructure no longer needed a conductor who kept his own records.